The great cities began to burn, not one, not two, across an entire world. Palaces fell silent, trade routes vanished, kings disappeared from their records. Bronze Age powers that had stood for centuries suddenly cracked under pressure. No one seemed able to stop. And from the sea, or so the ancient records say, came the attackers. Who were they? Where did they come from? And how could a force no one can clearly identify have helped bring down entire civilizations? For a moment, imagine the Eastern Mediterranean around 1200 BCE, not as a map, but as a living world, a connected world, fragile, brilliant, dangerous. Egypt, Hatti, Mycenaean Greece, Ugarit, Cyprus, Assyria. These were not isolated kingdoms. They were part of a web of diplomacy, trade, tribute, and power. Copper from Cyprus, tin from far away, moved through complex networks. Grain, wine, luxury goods, letters sealed by kings, chariots, fortresses, scribal elites. Bureaucracies so dependent on stability that even a small disruption could send shockwaves through the whole system. This was the Late Bronze Age. And then, almost all at once, it began to unravel. Not everywhere at exactly the same time. History is rarely that neat. But in a remarkably short span, roughly the late 13th to early 12th century BCE, major centers across the Eastern Mediterranean suffered collapse, abandonment, destruction, or radical transformation. The reasons are still debated: climate stress, drought, earthquakes, internal rebellion, economic overextension, succession crises, raiding, migration, a chain reaction of catastrophe where one breakdown triggered another. But into this chaos enters one of the most famous and most elusive names in ancient history, the Sea Peoples. They are not a single clearly defined nation in the modern sense. That is the first thing to understand. The label itself is modern, a convenient term historians use for a group of peoples or coalitions mentioned in Egyptian sources and connected, in various ways, to the upheavals of the Late Bronze Age. The ancient records do not describe one unified ethnicity with one leader and one homeland. They mention different groups, some of which may have been part of a larger movement, some of which may have had separate origins, and some of which may have been names for mobile war bands, migrant communities, or coalitions of displaced people. That uncertainty is not a weakness in the story. It is the story. Because the Sea Peoples are not a neat explanation. They are a question mark that appears right when the world starts breaking apart. Before we can understand the collapse, we need to understand how extraordinary the Bronze Age world actually was. This was an international system long before the word global existed. The palace economies of the Eastern Mediterranean were connected by commerce and diplomacy in ways that feel startlingly modern. Kings wrote to each other. They exchanged gifts. They married into foreign dynasties. They coordinated shipments of metal, textiles, timber, ivory, and grain. At Ugarit, on the coast of modern Syria, archaeologists have found archives of cuneiform tablets showing a sophisticated kingdom tied into a vast diplomatic network. These tablets reveal a world of merchant correspondence, royal orders, military alerts, and anxious messages in the face of growing instability. In the Mycenaean world of Greece, palatial centers like Pylos, Mycenae, Tyrans, and others represented highly organized societies with scribal administration, redistributive economies, and military power. In Anatolia, the Hittite Empire ruled from its capital at Hattusa, a huge imperial center with treaties, vassal kings, and complex politics. In Egypt, the new kingdom stood as one of the great powers of the age, wealthy, literate, and militarily formidable. This was not a primitive world teetering on the edge of chaos. It was an advanced, interconnected civilization system. And that is exactly why the collapse was so devastating. Because when such a system is stable, it looks strong. But when it is stressed, the connections that make it powerful can become the same connections that spread disaster. A drought in one region can disrupt grain supplies in another. A raid in one coastal city can break trade further inland. A palace fire can destroy administration, memory, and legitimacy all at once. A succession crisis can weaken diplomacy. A migration can put pressure on borders. An earthquake can damage fortifications, ports, and settlements. Multiple disasters, overlapping, can become one giant failure. This is why so many scholars today think the collapse of the Late Bronze Age cannot be explained by a single cause, and the Sea Peoples may have been part of that chain, or the symptom of it, or both. What do the ancient sources actually say? Most of what we know comes from Egypt, especially the reign of Ramesses III in the early 12th century BCE. The most famous evidence is the reliefs and inscriptions at Medinet Habu, which depict battles by land and sea against groups identified by Egyptian scholars as part of the Sea Peoples. These reliefs are dramatic, and they are meant to be. They show ships in violent conflict. They show warriors with feathered headdresses, round shields, and distinctive weapons. They show women and children in ox carts, suggesting that these were not merely raiders on a quick strike, but people moving with families and belongings, or at least that the Egyptians wanted to present them that way. And that image matters, because it suggests movement, not just attack, displacement, not just piracy, pressure from one place to another. The idea of entire populations on the move, brought into collision with the states of the Eastern Mediterranean. Among the names associated with these groups are the Peliset, the Sheridan, the Shekelesh, the Denian, the Tjeker, and the Weshesh. Some of these names may correspond to peoples later known in other contexts. Some are debated. Some may represent ethnic groups. Others may be political coalitions, local designations, or Egyptian approximations of foreign names. And this is where the evidence becomes both fascinating and fragile. For example, the Peliset are often associated by scholars with the Philistines of the southern Levant, based on archaeological and textual evidence. The Sheridan have sometimes been linked to Sardinia, though that connection is uncertain and debated. The Danaan have sometimes been connected to the Danaans of Greek tradition, though that is far from proven. These associations are hypotheses, not settled facts. What we can say with confidence is that the Egyptian sources describe foreign groups attacking Egypt and its territories by both land and sea in the period around 1200 BCE, and that these groups formed part of the wider crisis that reshaped the Eastern Mediterranean. We can also say that Egypt, unlike many of its neighbors, survived the collapse, though weakened and no longer the uncontested power it had been. That survival gives us one of the few windows into the disaster. The Egyptians were not merely describing rumor, they were describing a real military emergency. But who were these people, really? That question has kept historians busy for generations. And the honest answer is that there is no single accepted answer. One theory is that the Sea Peoples were invaders from outside the Eastern Mediterranean, perhaps from the Aegean, perhaps from Western Anatolia, perhaps from the Central Mediterranean, perhaps from multiple regions at once. The material culture of some sites in the Levant, especially those associated with the early Philistine settlements, shows Aegean-style elements in pottery and architecture. This has led many scholars to argue that at least some of the sea peoples came from the Aegean world or had strong Aegean connections. Another theory is that they were displaced populations from collapsing states. In this view, the sea peoples were not a neatly defined ethnic bloc, but refugees, mercenaries, raiders, and opportunists gathered into migrating groups by the collapse of their original societies. Climate stress, famine, political collapse, and warfare could have pushed these people into motion. Once they were on the move, they may have turned to raiding simply to survive. A third theory is that they were a reaction to a broader system's failure. In other words, the sea peoples were not the primary cause of the Bronze Age collapse. They were one expression of it. The real engine was a cascading breakdown of trade, governance, and food supply. As states weakened, more people moved. As people moved, more conflict erupted. As conflict erupted, states weakened further. In that sense, the sea peoples were both agents and products of collapse. A fourth possibility is that the term masks multiple unrelated groups. The Egyptians may have used a broad label for different peoples, attacking from the sea over a period of time. If so, the sea peoples are less a single historical entity than a category of crisis, a name the Egyptians gave to whatever enemy arrived from the maritime horizon during a terrifying age. Any one of these theories might contain part of the truth. None of them solves the whole mystery. The reason the sea peoples loom so large in the historical imagination is not only because they appear at a moment of collapse. It is because they seem to move through the collapse itself, like a blade through cloth. Look at the pattern. The Hittite Empire collapses. Hattusa is abandoned and burned. Ugarit is destroyed, and its final letters speak with horrifying urgency about approaching enemies and desperate appeals for help. Mycenaean palatial centers are burned or abandoned. Some recover in reduced form. Most do not. Trade networks shrink or disappear. Literacy declines sharply in some regions. Population patterns shift. Political structures fragment. And in the same general horizon of time, the Egyptian records speak of invasions by groups from the sea. Was this coincidence? Or were the sea peoples part of the mechanism by which the collapse spread? This is where history turns almost detective-like, because the evidence is real, but incomplete. We have destruction layers in archaeology. We have broken tablets. We have palace ruins. We have trade patterns that suddenly stop. We have texts warning of famine, danger, and enemy movement. We have images carved in stone by Egyptians celebrating victory over invaders. But we do not have a sea people's manifesto. We do not have their own chronicles. We do not have a clear map showing their homeland and route. We have consequences and fragments. It is tempting to imagine them as an unstoppable horde. Ancient propaganda and modern storytelling both encourage this. A great, roaring wave of barbarians sweeping from the sea and smashing civilization to pieces. But that picture is probably too simple. For one thing, the sea peoples appear to have been defeated, at least in Egypt. Rameses III claims victory, and while royal inscriptions are never neutral, there is no reason to assume the Egyptian response was imaginary. Egyptian defenses, including naval and land engagements, likely stopped or redirected some of these groups. The reliefs at Medinet Habu suggest not only battle, but also the resettlement or defeat of enemy groups. For another thing, no single invasion can easily explain the collapse of so many different societies across such a wide region. A more likely picture is messier and more human. Some groups may have been raiders. Some may have been migrants looking for land and food. Some may have been warriors attached to displaced populations. Some may have been recruited as mercenaries by one power or another. Some may have been pushed into motion by drought or famine. Some may have been coastal peoples whose maritime skill gave them an advantage in a world where the seas connected rather than separated regions, and in a world already weakened by economic and political stress. Even relatively small groups could do massive damage. Think of it this way. A palace system depends on order. It depends on predictable shipments of grain, copper, tin, labor, and tax. It depends on the legitimacy of kings, the functioning of scribes, the reliability of roads and ports, and the belief that tomorrow will look enough like today to justify the system. Now imagine drought, imagine earthquakes, imagine internal revolts, imagine trade disruption, imagine a series of raids along the coast, imagine a kingdom whose allies can no longer help. Imagine another kingdom already collapsing, sending refugees into your territory. Imagine famine, disorder, and fear spreading across the region. In such a world, the arrival of seaborne attackers may not need to be uniquely powerful to be devastating. They only need to arrive at the worst possible time. That may be the real horror of the Sea Peoples. Not that they were superhuman, not that they were one perfect enemy, but that they may have been the human face of systemic breakdown, a wave of people driven by crisis, a wave of warriors testing weakened states, a wave of migrants, refugees, and raiders moving along the same routes as merchants once had, a wave that no single kingdom could absorb without trembling. This is why modern historians often resist overly dramatic certainty. The old story, that the Sea Peoples caused the Bronze Age collapse, is too neat. The newer view is more nuanced. The Sea Peoples probably contributed. They may have accelerated destruction. They may have struck already weakened societies. They may have been one element in a much larger and more complex collapse. That does not make them less important. If anything, it makes them more important. Because history is often not changed by one giant cause, but by a series of shocks hitting a system that can no longer absorb them. There is also an emotional dimension to this story that the data alone cannot fully capture. The people living through the end of the Bronze Age did not know they were living through the end of an age. They did not wake up and think, today the late Bronze Age collapses. They saw grain shortages. They saw roads becoming dangerous. They saw letters unanswered. They heard rumors of enemies. They watched palaces burn. They buried the dead. They fled. They fought. They prayed. For a scribe at Ugarit, the final tablets may have felt like ordinary, desperate correspondence. For a soldier in Egypt, the battle against the Sea Peoples may have felt like one more defense of a vulnerable frontier. For a farmer in the Aegean, the collapse may have been slower, more confusing, a disappearance of authority, a thinning of trade, a silence where the palace used to be. Collapse is rarely a single moment. It is a sequence of losses, and in that sequence, the Sea Peoples are the names attached to one terrifying chapter. What happened to them after that? Again, the answer depends on which group we mean. Some populations associated with the Sea Peoples appear to have settled in the Levant. The Philistines are the most famous example. Archaeology in Philistine sites shows early cultural connections to the Aegean, followed by gradual integration into the local Canaanite environment. Over time, their distinct origins became less visible. They became part of the local political landscape. Other groups may have dispersed, been absorbed, or vanished into new identities. Some may have returned home if they ever had a stable homeland in the first place. Some may have died in battle or famine. Some may have become mercenaries in the service of states that survived the collapse. The point is that the Sea Peoples do not appear as a single people continuing after the crisis. The label fades because the world that produced the label itself changed. That may be the final irony. The Sea Peoples are remembered as destroyers of a civilization, but they also seem to have been survivors of one or several. People moving through a world already falling apart. People whose mobility made them appear as a sudden menace, even though their own lives may have been shaped by the same collapse that they helped intensify. Were they invaders? Yes, in some contexts. Were they migrants? Probably, in part. Were they raiders? Very likely. Were they refugees? Possibly, even probably for at least some of them. Were they a single ethnic group? We do not know, and the evidence suggests probably not in the simple way older histories imagined. So, what are we left with? We are left with cities in ash. We are left with broken tablets. We are left with Egyptian reliefs showing battle on the water. We are left with names that may or may not correspond to real ethno-linguistic groups. We are left with the slow silence after the Bronze Age world stopped speaking in the same way. And we are left with a question that refuses to die. Who were they really? Not just as raiders or invaders, not just as migrants or mercenaries, not just as a convenient label for chaos. Who were the Sea Peoples as human beings? The truth may be that they were many things at once, that the name covers a mixture of peoples, motives, and disasters, that they were formed by the collapse they are blamed for, and that they helped cause the collapse they survived, that they were less a single tribe than a moving edge of history, where hunger, war, and displacement met the coast. If that is true, then the Sea Peoples were not a myth. They were a warning. They show us how quickly a complex world can become fragile. How trade can turn to panic. How migration can become invasion. How a network of states can collapse when too many shocks arrive at once. How the sea, source of connection, wealth, and exchange, can also become the highway of catastrophe. And perhaps that is why they still matter. Because the story of the Sea Peoples is not only about the ancient world, it is about what happens when the structures holding civilization together begin to fail. One by one, then all at once, the palaces burn, the tablets stop, the kings vanish, and from the horizon the ships keep coming. Who were they really? We may never know, but they changed history forever.